Build it, and they will come. These words are often true for developers who dream of making money from the building of attractions that become popular, beloved, and draw people from far and wide. Attractions such as theme parks, museums, and sports stadiums have to be located somewhere so that people can get to them relatively easily and enjoyably. This is why they are almost always built in or near major urban centers, easily accessible by car or public transportation. But one such 20th century amusement park wasn't accessible by any of those means, and yet proved to be a beloved and lasting summertime pilgrimage for thousands of visitors every year, from 1898 until it closed in 1993. The amusement park was called BobLo, and it was located on an island in the Detroit River 18 miles south of downtown Detroit, Michigan. The only way one could get to the island was by ferry boat from Detroit or Gibraltar, Michigan, or Amherstburg, Ontario in Canada. But that didn't prevent people from coming, as the majority of park attendees boarded either one of two ships at the Detroit location for a 1-hour, fun-filled ride to the island. In fact, some say the boat ride was the best part of the visit to the park. The park was enjoyed by millions of kids, adults, and families over the span of its almost 100-year existence. It was a cultural icon for the people in the Detroit area, and many referred to it as Detroit's own Coney Island. Yet, now it's gone, with little or no evidence of it ever being there in the first place. How did BobLo come to be, and what happened to it? The rise of the BobLo Island Amusement Park coincided with the rising and falling fortunes of the Detroit, Michigan area in the 20th century. In fact, the same economic factors that built the Motor City also helped the park become popular and successful. During the late 19th century, the Detroit area had not yet experienced its economic boom brought about by the explosive growth of the North American domestic auto industry. Back then, the city had grown steadily from the 1830s with the rise of the shipping, shipbuilding, and manufacturing industries, as it was strategically located along the Great Lakes waterway. In fact, Detroit emerged as a major port and transportation hub. At the time, the population of Detroit was 286,000 people, but that was nowhere near as populous as in 1950, with a population of 1,850,000 within the city limits. In the surrounding Detroit metro area, the population swelled at 3.2 million people. This was all thanks to the booming auto industry and the millions of people who migrated to Detroit seeking well-paying jobs building auto parts and assembling cars on automotive plant assembly lines. The island isn't officially known as BobLo. Its actual name is Bois Blanc Island, which is French for white woods, because of the many birch and beech trees located there. BobLo is an English portmanteau of the French pronunciation of the name. The island is about 2.5 miles long, half a mile wide, and includes 272 acres of land. As late as the 18th century, Bois Blanc Island was an agricultural settlement for First Nation families. The island once served as a strategic defense outpost for Canada in the 18th century when it was still a British colony. In 1838, the island was the location of the invasion point for 60 Canadian rebels during the Upper Canada Rebellion. The island also served as a transition point for many ex-slaves on the Underground Railroad to Canada. One estimate puts 30,000 people as having had crossed over between 1834 and 1860. Bois Blanc Island was partially developed in the 1870s and 1880s with the addition of some stables to support horse riding, some picnic areas, and some streets and roads. However, these were for private functions hosted by the island's owner, McKee Rankin, whom had bought the island from his father in 1869. By 1886, the McKee family divided the island up into 317 lots that were offered for sale at $250 each. The island changed hands a few times after that, but in 1897, the Detroit, Belle Island, and Windsor Ferry Company purchased a small area as an investment for development of a park to boost revenues of their ferry business during the summertime off-season. In 1898, a new ferry route was created called the Bois Blanc Excursion Line that would bring visitors to and from the park each day. Within the first years of the park's opening, the company constructed an athletic field, baseball diamonds, bathing facilities, and a quarter-mile bicycle track. Also, a 75-boat marina, an observatory, tennis courts, a bathhouse, cottages, and other facilities were built to draw in the crowds. The grounds were made park-like as well, with the planting of grass, flowers, trees, and shrubs. However, no lighting was incorporated, as they did not wish the park to become a haven for midnight owls. Later on, though, lighting would later be utilized with one of the first uses on the park's carousel. Officially, the park opened to the public in June of 1898, with the ferry named Promise, bringing guests which included the Detroit Newsboys group to the park from Detroit. The park was so well received during its first year of operation that the company began to purchase more of the island and install additional facilities. These improvements attracted even more park goers, which allowed the company to eventually purchase all but a small portion of the rest of the island. In the first decade of the new century, increasing profits from the park would see the ferry company buy 3 new steam-powered ferries that could accommodate up to 2,500 passengers each. These were the Columbia in 1902, the Britannia in 1906, and the St. Clair in 1910. All of the ships had dance floors and beer halls on separate decks, and was a great way to set your spirits soaring and start and end your BobLo Island adventure. These were important parts of the BobLo experience. The Columbia and the St. Clair were in service for almost 85 years until 1991, 2 years before the park closed for good. The ships were unique in their appearance and were Detroit icons for decades, and even appeared in local area TV commercials for other businesses and brands. Occasionally, the ferries were even used as excursion boats at various times, where people would pay to go on cruises that didn't go to the park at all. People would board the ships in Detroit and go on party cruises up and down the Detroit River and Lake St. Clair. Although no annual attendance figures are available, the park steadily grew in size, attraction quantity, and profits in the early to mid-20th century. As the auto industry grew and prospered, so too did the fortunes of BobLo Island. It became a summertime ritual to go to the park at least once every season for many Detroit area families. The park even had its own brand emissary in the form of a character named Captain BobLo. Captain BobLo was portrayed by an appropriately named man, Joe Short. Mr. Short was a former circus clown and was small in physical stature, standing only 4 foot 1 inch, and traveled on the ships entertaining passengers of all ages. He wore a variety of colorful clothing, including a large hat with Captain BobLo on its peak, and was typically equipped with binoculars for navigation purposes. He previously worked for Ringling Brothers Circus and captivated children with adventurous tales and knock-knock jokes until his retirement in 1974 at the age of 90. After the boats docked at night back in Detroit, Mr. Short continued entertaining at the local bars and taverns he frequented. Joe Short passed away on December 20th, 1974, at the age of 91. The park passed through the hands of numerous owners over the years who kept the BobLo party going strong throughout most of the 20th century. The park added more and more rides and was a serious competitor to other regional amusement parks such as Cedar Point, Geauga Lake, and Six Flags. So what happened? Starting in the 1960s, the addition of many new rides also created elevated injury risks and occurrences for ride operators and park guests. Many reported injuries of at least one death in 1965 caused by bad ride design, faulty or improperly maintained equipment, poor operator training, and general inattentiveness. By the mid-1970s, the park started to get the reputation as a risky place to bring your family if you wanted to avoid injury, maiming, or possible death. The crowds, too, began to become unruly and brought their urban problems and behavior to the park as well. These included assaults, fighting, robbery, and even gang skirmishes. In fact, on one day in 1988, after numerous fights had broken out in the park amongst rival gang members, the police were brought in to supervise the loading of the ferries back to Detroit with weapons drawn and wearing bulletproof vests. During the ferry ride back to Detroit from the island, knife fights broke out, with spectators rushing to other areas of the ship to seek safety. When the ship docked, people rushed the gangway to disembark, with some people jumping or pushed over the railing onto the dock. Park attendance steadily declined during the 70s and 80s and forced the owners to sell off rides to generate income to stay afloat. Of course, this was the beginning of the race to the bottom and only made the park less attractive to potential patrons. The question for many became, why go to a dodgy, dangerous park where you could get injured, assaulted, or killed for only a handful of creaky, old death trap rides? It was the beginning of the end. The park tried to modernize and get with the times by concession partnering with some national brands such as Domino's, Pepsi, and Tim Hortons, among others. The park even had a licensing tie-in with 20th Century Fox's Simpsons. In the early 90s, you could see Homer, Marge, and the rest of the crew roaming the park in costume, entertaining park-goers. But it was all for naught. Attendance kept decreasing, with 1990 attendance at 610,000, 1991 at 400,000, and only 280,000 people showing up in 1992. By the fall of 1992, after desperate attempts to sell, the park sought bankruptcy protection, and the park was sold at auction on February 10, 1993, for $3.7 million to an investment firm. The two large ferry ships, the Columbia and the St. Clair, were auctioned in 1996. Presently, both ships are in the process of being restored for new lives. However, a sad footnote regarding the St. Clair. During the restoration in 2018, the ship caught fire and burned down to the hull due to a spark from welding equipment. The new owner vows to carry on with the rebuild project and hopes to have it ready in the near future. As for the park, the equipment and rides were sold off and the land was developed as a residential community. Developers built upscale homes on the north side of the island there and sold them to buyers wishing to live an island lifestyle. The island is still accessible by ferry boat, but only from Amherstburg, Ontario, as the island is in Canadian territory. Some of the structures from the amusement park are still present on the island, including the dance hall, a dilapidated dock, a theater, and the tower. Could there ever be another park like this again? There could be. It just won't be on Bois Blanc Island. In the late 1990s, there were some ideas discussed by developers to create a new BobLo amusement park on the mainland near Amherstburg, Ontario. It would have included a luxury hotel, international shops and restaurants, a 107-berth boat dock, and a pier large enough to accommodate lake cruise ships. However, it never came to be. Most amusement parks these days are the type that are owned by large corporations, with enough working capital to update their parks regularly with new rides and attractions, and to continually fund large advertising budgets. Smaller BobLo type parks just can't compete with the larger players in the US market. Fortunately, we do have memories, old photographs, and footage of this venerable, once hugely popular Midwest icon of summertime fun that hopefully won't soon be forgotten. Hope you enjoyed the video and thank you for watching. I'm your host, Jay Burton. If you liked the video, you'll love our channel. Please subscribe below. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram.